Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, and friend, James Goad. And together, we're discussing the very weird things that preachers say, why they say them, and how they relate back to the latter-rain healing revivals of the late 1940s through 1960s. James, you have picked a doozy of a topic today. I don't even know how we're going to touch this. It is such a complex, complicated mess of things that when you shared the clip with me, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they said this in public, let alone, I can't believe that this is even said in private in this day and age. And that's just one of the clips that you found.
Yeah, there's such a whirlwind of different things that come out of the Branham movement and all of its splinter groups because, you know, there's the people who take what Branham said word for word around race, and people like Martin Luther King and all these different things around that time. They take it as gospel. It's inspired word. And you have other people who try to renegotiate it into current day politics and what's acceptable to say in public. And then you have a lot of things that just fall in a wide spectrum in between. And yeah, it is. It's quite a doozy when you start trying to pick out what all these ministers are saying and try to make it make sense, I guess, is for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah, and it's also a complicated mess just within the framework of the cult, because what was given to us as the public whitewashed version of the message, it was supposed to be all loving, all inclusive, and you're going to find large numbers of people with skin that is not white who have accepted the message, and they would say, no way is this in any way, shape, or form related to racist white supremacy, not knowing the history. And once you know the history and you match the timeline of what was happening in history with the timeline of what was being said, it gets really messy. And then where it gets difficult is, you know, the public version has been fully whitewashed, and even to the extent that there is a strong appearance that many phrases and words and even prophecies were cut out. And you can find, you can do the search for blank spot in tape, and you can find where these things are just mysteriously missing, where William Branham himself will say, and God spoke to me and I had a prophecy, blank spot on tape. And as you know, as a message believer, when you find that and you're studying that and you come across it when you're reading, you're like, wait a minute, why did they cut out a prophecy, right? But then you find that there are things that he said that apparently they missed when they started cutting things out. And things like where he said that Martin Luther King was going to lead his people to a slaughter. But when you think of what was happening in white supremacy during this era, the things that he said, like another phrase he said is that the blacks and whites would rise up and fight again. There would be this big race war coming. When they miss cutting things like that out, you can't really take the whitewash version where he says, and I love people of all color. You can't really say this because he's saying the same thing the white supremacists are saying during this era.
Well, especially when you take into account of Branham's way of saying he go into like California or something like that and say, well, I'm in a mixed crowd and things like that. And it's like, and then he'll say different things back home that he won't say out and when he's among other people that don't necessarily 100% share his beliefs. So it's like, well, you know, so you have to really be careful when you start parsing through what Branham says, because in one sense you'll say, well, he appears to be completely contradictory to what he says over here, but you got to find him when he's in his element and when he's really speaking what he truly believes, because that's when you can really hone in on really what's going on and really what's the context underneath of what's being said.
Yeah, I was really surprised once I understood that mixed crowd wasn't just talking about gender. Whenever when the man started saying that, you would hear the minister speaking. Now, he was speaking to a mixed crowd and men and women. And so you really don't think about it. You think, okay, mixed crowd, females, males, but you're not really thinking, wait a minute, there are instances where the mixed crowd meant color of skin, and that becomes so highly problematic.
Yeah, and it filters through even today with the way that some of the ministers try to like renegotiate and reorganize and try to make it make sense with today's politics, and even some outright sort of say the quiet part out loud in some situations, depending on what their actual underlying beliefs are. But I think it'd probably be good to start off with these first couple clips here and dive in further with what we're seeing here.
And the first thing he said was over here in verse 28. He said, you know that it's unlawful for me, being a Jew, to keep company with you of another nation. That was they had strict segregation. The Americans, we've decided in this day and age, we're going to just have integration. Well, it's not worked out all that great, especially in the world. And the believers, it's different. But over there, they had this strict segregation. And you couldn't even, no, those are heathen. We're the people of God.
Wow, James. Like I said, that is a doozy. I conceal the churches and the people whenever we do this podcast because we're not singling out any person, and everybody's manipulated in the same way. But I think what I will point out is that this is one of the most respected people in all of the sects of the message. This is a person who is in the Branham family. I'll just say it like that and leave it like that. This is a person who is in the Branham family and has business entities and organizations and is beholden to all of this mess. So he is he's a person of interest. I will still not mention his name because he, like me, was probably manipulated. But what he's saying is, you see, the cult is in this weird position now. It has now became widely known that William Branham was working with the second in command of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan and continued to work with him for years. His name is mentioned all throughout, Roy E. Davis. And William Branham was spreading the Christian identity doctrine. As we, in this year, as we're going through all of the research material that we're compiling on British Israelism and its transition into Christian identity, we have become aware that William Branham was a strong component of Christian identity, even though where Christian identity ended up is not where Branham did. Branham likely would have, because his life was cut short. 1965, his life was cut short. But he is saying the exact same things that all of the Christian identity leaders were saying in the era, right down to the serpent seed doctrine, which was Wesley Swift's version of Christian identity. And Swift is one of the he's one of the key figures of Christian identity, which his specific flavor ended up into the neo-Nazis and the skinheads and the Aryan nations. It's some really, really bad stuff. So the cult is in this weird place, right? You've got all of this white supremacy background, and now people are being made aware that William Branham was outspoken against those who were battling for equal opportunity. And so the position that these guys have taken is that Branham was saying these horrific racist things because it didn't work out so well. And in doing so, they're repeating these horrific things, and they think they're taming it down so that the people aren't as offended. But I have to say, if I had black skin, I would be just as offended.
Yeah, there's so many problems, and with all of the statements Branham made around race, you can say, like some ministers do, it's a product of his time, but at the same time, you're taught when you're in the actual movement itself, you were taught that what Branham was bringing was the further fulfillment of scriptures for this day and this hour, and it was supposed to carry us through to the finale, to the rapture. But we've progressed socially beyond that time, and Branham's words still are stuck in that time, and they get worse and worse and worse the farther you get from it, and the more we progress as a society. And if those words were supposed to bring us through to the rapture, then in the way the message, conceptualizes the rapture, of course, but shouldn't those words also have been able to carry through? And some try to excuse it, some try to renegotiate it, and others just say it because they're like, he said it, he's the prophet of our day, and so they just repeat it. And you just cannot escape from all of the problematic ways in which he spoke about race, in which he spoke about all the people of the time who were standing up against racial injustice, and by extension, his stance that he's taking on the subject through the ways he's trying to tear down these people, like Martin Luther King Jr. And it's just problematic, and you can't get away from it without calling it out for what it is, and that's something that the Branham movement hasn't done. It hasn't tried to reform in any way and call out these passages and say, this is wrong. We don't believe this. He was wrong for saying this. And maybe some guy does in some corner somewhere that I haven't heard. But you have to call these things out, and you have to say, this is racism. We don't believe this. This man was racist. They just won't say it. Some they'll just act like these passages don't exist. These quotes don't exist. They'll skip over them. They won't bring them up. They'll do all these things to try to hide from what's going on. But the thing about it is when you hide from it and then people find it, the question is, why are you hiding from these things that are obviously problematic? Because they're here and we have to address them.
For me, one of the bigger problems is one of the cult theologies is that of perfectionism. William Branham was coming to perfect the quote-unquote bride, and his words are leading us to perfection. Now, in society, I don't always agree with how you get from point A to point B, but we as the human race have a means of perfecting ourselves through time, through education, and when I say education, I mean learning from our mistakes. We do something that's very wrong, very bad. That gets called out, and we educate ourselves to the fact that, hey, the way we were isn't the way we want to be, and we strive to be better. Doesn't always work out, and again, I don't always agree with how you get from point A to point B, but in the end, if you compare where the United States was in the 1950s and 60s to where it is today, I can say that there are a lot of things that we do a lot better. Now, we've introduced new problems, and there are things that years from now, decades from now, we're going to hope gets better in those areas. But the problems that we had in the 50s and 60s, many of those things are now better. William Branham's words were captured during that era, however, and his mindset was the mindset of the very wrong things that we as a society have now corrected. But we're being told this is the absolute truth that's leading us into perfectionism. And there is the conundrum, right? Because the things that he got vastly wrong and we're stuck in the era of days gone by, we're being told in today's world that this is leading us into perfection. And instead, what it is doing is it is leading people in a circle back to the very wrong things of the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and it even shows the harm that these sorts of things keep perpetrating today when and one thing that I don't want to forget too quickly is coming off these last set of clips, the idea that integration hasn't worked out too well, or this idea that we maybe can't integrate with people of other races. Let's put a pin in that one, and I think we'll have a nice way to circle back to that later in the episode through some further clips. But for now, let's move on to some other ones here. And there's some there's a lot of issues when people try to renegotiate what Branham's saying or try to make it fit, because one of the things that he did was he demonized Martin Luther King Jr. in 63. And a lot of Branham's quotes were actually before Martin Luther King's most famous speech later in the year in 63, the I Have a Dream speech. That is one of the speeches that most people, when they hear about Martin Luther King Jr., that is one of the speeches that they're familiar with, maybe not in whole, but the larger parts of it that have been disseminated the most throughout popular culture and through history. But Branham is taking a staunch stance against him and saying things like he's going to lead his people into a death trap and he's communistic inspired. These are very interesting things, especially the communistic inspired, because one of the things that has been exposed is that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI at the time was very actively against communism, into the fact that it saw communism almost like a boogeyman around every corner. It's like communism's hiding under my bed sort of thing. And it almost to the irrational sense that everything and everybody that I disagree with is a communist. And it gets absurd to a certain extent. But one of the things that's interesting is at the same time that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI is pushing this very heavy idea that Martin Luther King Jr. is a communist and he's leading the people in communism, or he's trying to spread communism, Branham is also saying that he's communistic inspired over the pulpit, which is a very interesting coincidence at the very least. And it further goes to show how Branham's sort of ideas about this are being shaped by a very racist undertone of the era of the same time. It's not, he's not sitting up high on his own platform getting these messages from God to say that he's communist inspired, even though that's what some message people believe, is that if he's speaking it, then he's obviously getting some signal from God because he's, in their terms, the prophet of the age. But when you come down to it and you hear people start bringing these things into today and start preaching them over their pulpits, there's some very interesting things that get said when people try to make it fit with history. So I think that's a pretty good way to roll into this next clip here. And let's see what this minister says.
So what do you mean, brother? You got to understand where Brother Branham was.
Vous devez comprendre comment était Frère Branham en son temps et en son jour.
He was in a time when America was chaotic.
Il vivait dans un temps où l'Amérique était
chaotique. You had the Beatles.
Il y avait des Beatles.
You had Elvis Presley.
Il y avait Elvis Presley.
You had Martin Luther King.
Il y avait
Say it.
Martin Luther King.
And we thought,
et nous avions
because
pensé,
we were so carnal,
parce que nous étions charnels,
we didn't know.
Nous ne savions pas
he was moving in the realm of socialism.
Qu'il avançait dans la dimension du socialisme.
Can I say it?
Est-ce que je peux le dire?
He was the one that caused everybody to talk.
Il était celui qui avait amené des gens à nous unir.
If you don't know what I'm talking about,
si vous savez pas ce dont je parle,
ask me after service.
So let's not talk about it in public, brothers. Let's go offline where I'm not being recorded, and let's talk about this in private. You know, it's just so wrong. The position that ministers have taken on this, because they're all aware that this is a racist thing that William Branham is saying. William Branham is condemning one of the most outspoken figures in civil rights. Where it gets really odd to me, and I just, you know, the whole thing is odd, but where it gets really, really odd is that what they end up doing, many of them, is they'll go off into conspiracy theories and say that let's ignore all of the good that Martin Luther King Jr. did, and let's ignore the fact that today people with black skin and people with white skin can ride the same bus. They can use the same bathroom. They can be seen as equals. Let's forget that Martin Luther King was a reason why we ended up there. Let's find some dirt on the guy and let's go dig up. Maybe he's sleeping with another woman. I've actually heard this from one of them. Maybe he was an adulterer. So therefore, let's ignore the fact that we have racial integration today. That's what they do, and a lot of them, they don't want to get caught on recording, especially now that you and I are doing what we're doing. They don't want their name to be out there associated with them being white supremacists. Let's call it like it is. What they're saying is white supremacy, and so they'll get off of recording. Let's go talk in private, brothers, and I will spread my white supremacy to you in private.
Yeah, and the thing that's interesting here is this ministry even diverges from Branham in a way, because he says that Martin Luther King was moving in the realm of socialism, not communism, and Branham said that he was communistic inspired. Which is very interesting, because communism and socialism, while they share a lot of traits, they have differences, and they have major differences. And one of the things that it's not fair to do to people in these congregations is to throw things like communism and socialism and capitalism at them across the pulpit, especially in a religion that very talks down about education, because these subjects are very complicated, and they're theories of economic systems. And, you know, you can just say, oh, he's moving in the realm of socialism. Then most people will be like, okay, I've heard something about socialism. I don't know what socialism is, whatever. But I think it's very problematic to throw these buzzwords out at people when they don't even have the educational background to fully appreciate what's being said about these topics. And also, to be fair to this minister here, Martin Luther King was somebody who had read Marx and Marxist theory. Martin Luther King, in letters to his wife, before she became his wife, said that while there's good things about capitalism, I also see things that maybe we could do better, and maybe some socialistic things are maybe some of the answers. But what you find is that Martin Luther King appears to be somebody who was, by my estimation, somebody who was trying to look at the injustices of the time in a system where he's in a capitalistic system, and trying to make sense of what's going on with this economic theory. And if you listen to all of his quotes on the matter, and especially when you talk to communism, he very viciously denounces communism. And, you know, while at the same time he's read Marx, he knows at least a little bit about Marxist theory, and Marx was, you know, a socialist. You have somebody who's intellectually trying to parse out what these different theories may have to offer in his struggle for equal rights, and trying to find ways to move forward into a future that maybe has a better outcome for the people in which he's fighting for. It's not so easy to say that just because Martin Luther King read Marx and there's a few points of socialism, he says, hey, maybe I like some of these points better, or maybe I think they would mix better with what we're striving for, doesn't equal that Martin Luther King is a socialist. It's a very complicated subject, and it's not something that you can just so easily boil down to he is X or Y.
You know, it's complicated, but more to the point, this is all history. And unless you understand the history and you understand what is Marxism, what is communism, and more to the point, what is white supremacy? What were the white supremacists saying during this era? Suddenly, all of this makes sense, where unless you know that history, it really didn't. Because when William Branham says that Martin Luther King was a communist and he was communist inspired, you're immediately thinking, okay, Russia is communist, so maybe he's working with Russia, or the Chinese are communist. Maybe he's working with the Chinese. No. What William Branham is saying is exactly what white supremacists, the Ku Klux Klan, the National States Rights Party, the Christian Identity Party, the White Christian Nationalist Party, all of these movements in this era were saying that Martin Luther King was a communist, because they were calling with a wide sweeping brush anybody who had black skin, anybody that meant a Jew, a African American or an African, Islamic, anybody who had black skin were invading the United States, and it was going to be a communist threat because they would end up joining with Russia and overthrowing the United States government. This was the conspiracy theory during the era. So whenever William Branham labeled Martin Luther King with the label of communist, he is proclaiming his allegiance to white supremacy. Make no mistake, it is his allegiance to the white supremacy groups, one of which, the National States Rights Party, was headquartered in Jeffersonville, Indiana, William Branham's hometown. We shared articles from their newsletter where they were saying the same exact thing. Martin Luther King is communist, and all of these people are communist-inspired people. What he's saying is white supremacy. Where it gets problematic, James, these ministers who parrot William Branham for no other purpose than just to parrot William Branham, many of them don't even study the guy. They have no idea what he's talking about, no idea what he's saying. When William Branham makes a mistake and incorrectly quotes Bible verses that he himself invented, these guys will parrot the Bible verses, thinking that William Branham's a prophet, so he must know his Bible pretty well, and not knowing that they're in violation of the whosoever shall add to or take away from this book. That's how bad this gets. Well, they're also parroting white supremacy. And in my humble opinion, and you're welcome to your opinion, whenever somebody is parroting a white supremacist and they're in a position of power and leadership, they themselves are white supremacists.
I think that's a very fair way to characterize it. I mean, yeah, there's so much that's done to excuse and not enough done to just be honest about the history around Branham and a lot of his thoughts and a lot of the things he said about, the civil rights movement and things like that. And if ministers were being honest, they would have to say, okay, listen, even if they still want to believe in the guy, if they were going to be honest about what was being said here, they would say, listen, this was obviously a very racist thing that he was espousing here, and he was obviously very wrong for what's going on here, and we do not agree with the things that he said here, and that would be, I would have to give some of these ministers, if they were willing to do that, I would have to give them kudos for that, because it's very tough, especially in a system like this, to do that. But the reason why we don't see that, and the reason why we see ministers shy away from it, is because you are openly talking about this man who was supposed to bring the revealed word of the hour, and saying that he's openly being racist. And that's something that you can't do, because then you have to go back and examine all the other things he said, like my precious colored friends, things where he tries to appear to be talking about people in what would appear, if just on face value, if you don't understand what's really going on here, that he's saying nice things about people. But when you really dig down, and when anything as substantial is going on in the civil rights movement, there seems to be a problem that he has with what's going on. You can't integrate schools. You can't do all these things, because that's going to lead people to a death trap. If he was really spiritually inspired and had an angel speaking into his ear constantly, you got to imagine that angel at one point, but listen here, Mr. Branham, yeah, that's actually not what's going to happen. People are actually going to integrate, and things are actually going to get better. There's still going to be problems, and they're going to continue to work on these things, but it's going to get better. But instead, Branham moves full force with the idea that it's going to lead people into a death trap, and that death trap never happens.
Hallelujah. He says, listen, hybriding. He said, oh, how terrible hybriding. Here it goes. Hybriding the people. New York, the big melting pot. I got hundreds of precious colored friends that born again Christian. But on this line of segregation and things they're talking about, hybriding the people. What? Tell me what fine Christian colored woman would want her baby to be a mulatto by a white man. No, sir, it's not right. What white man would want her baby to be a mulatto by a colored man? God made us what we are. Let's stay what God made us. I believe it's right.
Well, James, hybriding the people. It seems like I remember another minister saying this recently and becoming widely famous in the wrong way, in all of the wrong ways for this. What people don't realize is that William Branham's hybriding doctrine, when you combine that with his serpent seed doctrine, the summation of these two doctrines, when added together, is the summation of Wesley Swift's Christian identity, white supremacy, racist doctrine. You cannot say, when you combine these two things, you cannot say that this serpent seed was a spiritual bloodline that he's talking about. No, he is talking about a physical bloodline entered into the world, and we should not hybrid it. He is specifically talking about two races and in fact, class system of people. You've got the higher race, which we, the people with white skin, are, and then you've got the lower race. And anybody who wants to argue that with me, go find one of the couples who has tried to get a minister to perform their wedding ceremony wherein one of them has black skin and one of them has white skin, and just go see what happens, see what they say, because that is what this ultimately leads to. It is a separation of the races, which is exactly what the white supremacists were wanting to do at that time, during this era. The mixture of races, the interracial marriage, was quote-unquote communist to the white supremacists of the era, also communist to William Branham, if you go study his sermons. So these men are parroting William Branham's white supremacy doctrine, again, in my opinion, making them white supremacist leaders because they're leading people into further white supremacy.
Yeah, and what's interesting here about this clip is what the minister says towards the end of this quote. He's talking about the hybriding, and he says, everything that this age of hybriding and everything that's hybrid is dead.
We know what Brother Branham is talking about is right, because they hybrid the corn, they hybrid the cow, they hybrid the chicken, they hybrid everything. This is the age of hybriding, and everything that hybrid is dead.
That's a very interesting way to phrase it, because you're denigrating anything that is of a hybrid relationship. And so you're saying, and I mean, you even look at the things that Branham said around, the children of a mixed relation, of a mixed, union, and there's all these things that it's just so problematic. And when ministers try to internalize these things and try to make them make sense with today's current day in which we live in, and where it's not something that you've got the Klan going to come around and burn somebody's house down because they're in a mixed marriage or whatever to, try to scare people away from these sorts of unions. There's all these sorts of things that we've moved beyond today. And to have people still parroting this stuff that should have, these sorts of ideologies should have died in the 50s. And honestly, they should have never been around to begin with, because it's such a black mark and a stain on our history that we even, our forefathers even thought this way, but to hear a minister parroting these things today and telling his congregation that anything that hybrids is dead, it's a very, very sick, twisted way to try to manipulate this doctrine in the people's minds of today, and as just a way as you have white supremacists saying this kind of stuff, the opposite way, you have black supremacists in some of these movements saying some similar things, saying that, if we don't want to mix with white people because we don't want to denigrate our line. And so, it's very unhealthy way to look at these things. And it's so sad to see this stuff even being perpetrated today.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you use the term black supremacists, because there are a lot of people that have no idea that that's even a thing. And, where you have any demographic of human beings that has a problem, you're going to find another demographic that has a similar problem. And in any situation where you have people that are so severely oppressed that you get somebody who has just they finally snap. They've had enough. They're going to come up swinging, no matter who they are. If you're in one of the situations where you're being oppressed and you have you've taken all you can take, you're going to fight to get more. Well, after what happened in the 1950s and 60s, after so many people with black skin were being brutally murdered and put into prisons wrongfully, just severely oppressed people, there were a number of people that came up swinging. And I'm not by any means defending them. Some of them are very, very bad people. Some of them were bad people and changed for the better. But you can't really blame them for what happened to them, because they went through some severe oppression that you and I will never, ever have. We can never, until we walk a mile in their shoes, we can never even say what it is that we would do. But to think that these ministers in today's world, in what is supposed to be a Christian religion, to think that they're parroting white supremacists of the 60s that are causing that oppression, it just blows your mind. Like, I can't believe in this day and age that people are doing this. I can't believe that they're raising children to be white supremacists. It just, for me, it angers me, James.
Yeah, and it's something that, you know, when you look back at the history, and some ministers have tried to renegotiate what's going on in Branham's time, because they know there's these things that are problematic, and so they try to say that, well, us believing this religion of that was ministered and organized and ran and led by a white supremacist that had very strong white supremacist ties, at the very least, you have people try to renegotiate and reorganize and say, well, let's look at the context, let's look at the time frame in which he was here, to try to whitewash and say, well, you know, he's a product of his time, necessarily, which is so unfair to do for a man to have, you know, the inspired word of God coming out of his mouth in one sentence, and the next it's like, well, he's a product of his time, so, you know, we should you know, look at these things in the lens of today and not necessarily judge him for what was going on there. It's a very interesting way to sort of frame it. But in this next clip, we have a minister that's sort of trying to set the stage for his congregation in the time frame in which some of this stuff was spoken, and a little bit of revisionist history going on, if I have to say myself. But let's play the clip and see what we think.
Now let's just take for a moment the backdrop behind Brother Branham. Here in America, just in America, we have a Cuban Missile Crisis. We have the vision of the youngest president to be elected, a Camelot of sorts. JFK is elected, and it's almost a Camelot that takes place. And he stands at his inauguration, said, it's not what this country can do for you, but it's what you can do for this country. Women given the right to vote. Visions happening so rapidly. Now think about the spirits that are being released. When Brother Branham is preaching some of these most incredible sermons, the Beatles come on the scene. And literally when they arrive in America, there's such an anointing on them until people that are sick go, and where they are getting off of the plane are healed, thinking that the Messiah has arrived. The race riots was everywhere in America. What you see today is the harvest of what Brother Branham was contesting with. Race was taking place. Let me just say something to you about race. We're Christians. We're Christians, and we all came from the Adamic race. We are Christians, and if you are prejudiced, here is an altar. Malcolm X was on the scene, and he was a militant part. He came out wanting to fight, wanting to kill, wanting to do a lot of different things. On the other side of that, the flip of that, was Martin Luther King, who was a phenomenal speaker, who was more polished in many of his ways, who actually was a great visionary, because he had a vision that one day that we could all live together. That's not on this earth, but there is coming a land.
These are white supremacy leaders, in my opinion, white supremacy leaders who are parroting a white supremacist who is working with the highest of ranking white supremacists. They're parroting William Branham. Branham is working with the highest ranking white supremacists. And they're saying things like this, that in this earth, we're never going to have integration. Come on, man. what era are you stuck in? I just have to ask that, because what else can you say to this? These men, they're stuck in the 50s and 60s themselves. They don't realize that, wait a minute, no, we can have integration. We can have people with black skin and white skin ride the same bus and use the same bathrooms. I'm blown away that you found this.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you really start digging in where all these ministers saying, and even when they try to whitewash it, even when they try to make it better, the underlying core ideology still rings through what they're saying, because, like, you know, he says here, if you're racist, there's an altar here, you know, for you, because we're not racist. But at the same time, he's telling them that the utopian vision of all races coming together and uniting and integrating, you know, is not something that's going to happen on this earth. It'll be in heaven, you know? And so it's like, why would you think that? There's a underlying core racist ideology that is woven throughout the entire message of William Branham. And that's how you come to these sorts of things, because, you know, this is the way Branham thought. So it's not very hard to see how some of these ministers get to the same conclusions.
Like it or not, this is a historical message. This thing was preached in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, actually earlier than that. Most of them don't know it, but they have taken a snapshot in time during one of the most horrific times in American history. That's the snapshot that we unfortunately have chosen. And they're parroting it, and they're preaching on it as if forever in time this snapshot should remain the same and exist. In fact, if you went to my grandfather's church, you'd hear him say, especially after the votes, everything remains the same. That's the way they want it. They want it to remain the same. And in doing so, they unfortunately, like I've said a few times now, in my opinion, they're white supremacist leaders. But they're more than that. They also are becoming educators. Because as history is slowly forgotten over time, well, these guys have to keep reminding people of the history so that this historical nonsense that came from the 40s, 50s, and 60s makes some sort of sense in today's world. They have to become educators of history. But they're on the wrong side of history. So where you end up with is you have, in my opinion, white supremacist educators who are educating and raising children to become white supremacists.
Yeah, I mean, when you don't really know your history all that well and you just parrot the things from a prophet messenger who himself was a buffoon and didn't know his history, didn't know his Bible, was, you know, chums and buddies with the Grand Dragon of the new KKK, you know, it's no wonder that these people can't get their history right. And some people, it's not just from a realm of ignorance. It's because they themselves believe these things and they are pushing them and trying to sneak them into their messages. You know, this particular one here, I mean, coming up, I mean, you've got very interesting things being said, and this is a clip from the 1990s of a minister who was very well known, very well respected in his time, before the decline of his own ministry, and, you know, because his direct ties with Branham and how much respect he garnered off of that wave after Branham's death, you know, it's very shocking to hear some of these things. And as you get closer to the source, people are more comfortable in what's being said because there's still more open support. You know, some of the quiet, today it would be saying the quiet part out loud. Then it's kind of saying the thing that we believe and just kind of saying it, you know, because you're closer in, you have more support. It's not quite so underground. So yeah, this is a very interesting clip. Let's take a look at this next one.
But it's strange that even Hitler couldn't bomb the Vatican, and nobody touches it. But he runs everything. Now the press is giving always him full credit for bringing peace in the world, bringing peace in the world. If you say a lie long enough and enough people believe it, won't be long till about everybody believes the lie, and you'll really believe it like nobody else did. And if you don't believe that, I tell you, you just hear the voices of Hitler and men like Hitler and Martin Luther King and these men that can really speak up with the Spirit on them. I got no problem with either one of them.
Oh my gosh, James. You talk about taking the wrong side of history. I I should stop and mention that this is one of the most respected names in all of the message. This is the man that, I mean, quite literally, this was William Branham's publicist. I'm still not going to give his name, but everybody who hears this quote, they're going to, if you're in the message cult following of William Branham, you already know who this person is. If you're outside of this, let's just say this was William Branham's publicist. This is the guy who outed William Branham for working with several homosexual men. This is the guy that publicly outed Branham for this. This is the guy who, when Branham was working with the adopted cousin of Adolf Hitler's Minister of Defense, William Branham was working with a true Nazi. I mean, this guy was not a good guy, and also, according to this person who I won't mention, was also homosexual. All of this is being presented to the people as if this is the right way of history. Hitler was on the correct side of history if you take what this man is saying to its full conclusion. No, man, this is not the right side of history.
Yeah, and to hear a man compare Hitler and Martin Luther King together, put them on the same level, and then say I have a problem with neither one of them. So you take someone who we all agree is really bad, and we're talking about Hitler here, and then you have someone who we say fought for social justice and fought to change the way that we view race in this country and to integrate and to turn away from racism as on a national level. And then you compare those two people and say, I've got no problem with either one of them. It is so mind-boggling to hear somebody say that in the exact same sense, because I can think of not one, just many things to have a problem with Hitler with. And it's just, I'm at a loss for words, John, honestly.
Yeah. I've heard time and time again, all of these ministers, they know this is wrong. And I'm using the word ministers loosely, very loosely quoted. In my opinion, they're white supremacist leaders because they're teaching white supremacy in today's era, which is still unbelievable. But what they end up doing is they know it's wrong, and so they end up having to make excuses for it. And in doing so, they make themselves look like even more of a fool because they're trying to defend white supremacy. And anybody who has any knowledge of the era in which they're referring to, they realize what these men are doing, and they suddenly start to realize, hey, wait a minute, these guys aren't being quite honest with me.
This last clip that we have here is another interesting look at how ministers try to wrestle with and renegotiate Branham's problematic statements around Martin Luther King. And I'll just say that this one's quite a doozy. So let's roll into it and let's see what we think.
And let me just lay this in. I'm not making the Martin Luther King thing, thus saith the Lord, because Brother Branham didn't. But I do say this right here. I do look at those things very closely because I study what was he seeing that he said I have an opinion on. I want to see what he's seeing. I hope you're all right with that. I'm not making it thus saith the Lord, but I know he's seeing something. It's just like when Brother Branham says, and people have a problem with 1977, I predict, under divine inspiration. Well, what's wrong with that statement? Right. You get inspired too, and I have too, and predicted things and thought things, and yet we were under real true inspiration.
James, if I take my car to a mechanic and the mechanic looks at it and there's a few things wrong with it, and he says, well, in my opinion, you probably need to change your alternator. I'm probably going to trust his advice as a mechanic, that he knows that the alternator is probably the problem. These guys, man, whenever William Branham has a failed prophecy, and like this, where he says William Branham had it under divine inspiration, well, man, a prophet's got one job. He's doing prophecy. When a prophet makes a prediction or gives something under quote-unquote divine inspiration, make no mistake, it is a prophecy. And to defend what William Branham said in a very racist way about Martin Luther King. The substance of this, for the audience that isn't aware, William Branham was preaching the race war theology. This was the key subject for white supremacists of the 1960s. These guys were saying that Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all of these guys were leading and building up to what would become a race war, and the race war would combine with communism, overthrow the United States government, and we as our white supremacist freedom fighters need to take our arms and overthrow all of this because the United States government has been infiltrated. And they became very militant. William Branham died before it reached the severe, the very extreme militant stance that it became. But make no mistake, he was part of it. And same with the mechanic example. If you're a white supremacist and you're saying what the white supremacists are, make no mistake, you are a white supremacist. William Branham was a white supremacist. These guys who are defending it, in my opinion, they're white supremacist leaders defending the white supremacy.
Yeah, and the sort of mental gymnastics that this minister takes here with trying to, because this is the cop-out that a lot of ministers use. They'll say that, well, if Branham didn't say, "Thus saith the Lord," even though there's times that he said, "Thus saith the Lord," that things, you're like, okay, well, that didn't happen. But then they'll take a situation where he appears to be prophesying, or he appears to be saying something inspired, that maybe he didn't say the exact words, "Thus saith the Lord," or "the angel told me," or things like that. They'll say, well, it's not inspired. And then you have this other sort of thing that I heard many times growing up in a message church, and they'll try to, they'll say that Branham himself said that when he saw into the future, he's claiming he saw into the future, he couldn't see beyond 1977 because everything he saw beyond that was pitch black. And it's very convenient when you have a guy who has been proven to have taken some of his prophecies from things he saw at the World's Fair that he attended, different things throughout history where you can show that, the so-called remote controlled car with the family playing the game in the back seat that was directly out of a magazine article. There's all these things. And it's very easy to see the future when you have something in the present that you're referencing to see the future. But when you can't actually see the future, it's very convenient to say everything is pitch black beyond 1977. And so ministers will use this as a cop-out to say, well, he couldn't quite see beyond 1977, so that's why some of his future things are a little muddy and it's not quite exactly how it could be. It sounds exactly like a con man to me, but, you can come to your own conclusion on that, I guess. But then the minister takes another stance and says, well, some have said, well, that's just his opinion. And then he says, I'll take his opinion over your opinion any day. I'll even take it over my opinion. So there's multiple layers to this, and there's multiple levels of cop-out that different ministers take depending on their own background and how they want to dice up some of these things he said. But at the end of the day, it's extremely problematic, and these people are not saying what needs to be said, that William Branham was preaching racist ideology over his pulpit, and they are not saying it for what it is and giving people a chance to examine it in a historical context, in an accurate historical context.
Yeah. I mean, logically think about how this works, James. I'm no prophet, so I can't say that I know exactly how that would work, but logically speaking, if you're seeing the date 1977 and then you can't see past it, you are seeing some sort of a chronological timeline. Otherwise, how would you know it's 1977? I think I said 1957. So if you can't see beyond this, you have some sort of a clear marker that, okay, I see all of the things happening to 1977, and then beyond this, I know nothing because my prophecy has limits. But the fact that he got almost 100% of it incorrect in between there, leading up to the 1977, they don't mention that. They don't mention that he got so much of it wrong, or that he waffled back and forth, and he would say the polar opposite of all of the things leading to 1977, in so much you can't even believe that he saw a single thing. So he's not got his timeline correct. If this was a prophecy, it wasn't a prophecy from God, because most of it, a majority, was incorrect. But then take it a step further. Most of his visions appear to match exactly what the white supremacists were envisioning for the future. They weren't claiming prophecy, but they were saying these bad things are going to happen because we have people with black skin in the United States that we are attempting to give equal rights to. Because William Branham is parroting those guys in effect become prophets to William Branham's parroting of what they're saying is coming. And it's all incorrect. Martin Luther King did not lead his people to this race war that all of the white supremacists were proclaiming. So in my opinion, you've got a white supremacist false prophet. You've got today in today's world, you've got all of these white supremacist leaders trying to lift up the dead guy and make him look like he's a prophet when they in fact know he was a false prophet. And they've got themselves in the situation that most of them can't get out of. That's their livelihood. That's how they make their money. That's how they drive their Cadillacs. So there's no way that many of these guys are going to give this up. So in my opinion, the whole system is so flawed. But fortunately, in today's world, you have social media, you have the school system, although they try to pull you out of it. You've got all sorts of ways in which you can become educated as to what happened in the past. And people are starting to wake up to this. Whether you and I talk about it or not, there are people that are becoming aware that these guys look an awful lot like the white supremacists of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Whether they are or not, I have my opinion. You're welcome to yours. People are waking up to this, and fortunately, there will be people who leave.
The other sad thing is that there's people who, outside of this movement, try to use Branham as a pillar to build their own ministries and their own new age movements, and even people that you and Charles have exposed that share lineage, branches coming off these different movements that spawned off of Branham and people that he was associated with. And there's people who read things like God's Generals, and they see Branham as such a pillar, as such somebody who is to be respected for these different things in these movements. But, I really hope some of these people have a chance to see some of this media that's been put out on this channel and others to be like, Branham is, if your movement is trying to prop Branham up and say he's a pillar of virtue and he's one of the people that God used in the 50s and 60s, then I would have a lot of questions for the person who's leading your movement.
Yeah, talk about the wrong foundation, man.
Yeah, 100%.
If you have weird doctrines that you'd like for us to discuss on the show, you can contact us on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an in-depth look at the dangers of being in these groups, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Latter Rain to Colonia Dignidad, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.